In this short video, we will learn about time clauses in English. Sentences with time clauses contain a main clause and a dependent clause. These two clauses are joined together by a connector. A connector is a word that refers to a specific point in time. In this video, we will examine some sentences that contain a main clause and a dependent clause joined together by a time clause connector. So let's look at the first example. In this example, the sentence is, Paul made a phone call while his manager answered some emails. The main clause in this sentence is, Paul made a phone call. This sentence contains a subject and a main verb and can stand independently as a sentence. The dependent clause is, while his manager answered some emails. This sentence is the dependent clause in the sentence because it cannot form a main sentence on its own. The time clause connector in this sentence is the word while. Let's look at another example. In this example, the sentence says, I always eat my breakfast before I go to work. In this sentence, the main clause is the part I always eat my breakfast. This contains a subject and a main verb and can stand independently as a sentence. The dependent clause is before I go to work. And in this sentence, the time clause connector is the word before. The punctuation in a sentence using time clause connectors depends on where the time clause connector appears in the sentence. So let's look at some examples of how we use punctuation in sentences using time clause connectors. When a time clause begins a sentence, we separate the dependent clause from the main clause using a comma. Let's look at some examples. In the first example, when he arrived, I opened the front door. This sentence begins with the time clause connector when. Because the sentence begins with the time clause connector, we separate the dependent clause from the main clause using a comma. In the second example, after I got my new job, I celebrated with my friends. This example also begins a sentence with a time clause connector using the word after. Because the time clause connector appears at the beginning of the sentence, we separate the dependent clause from the main clause using a comma. When a time clause comes in the middle of a sentence, we do not use commas to separate the main clause from the dependent clause. Let's look at two examples. In the first example, Mark goes shopping every time he visits a new city. The word every time is the time clause connector. Because the time clause connector appears in the middle of the sentence, we do not use a comma to separate the two clauses. In the second example, she opened her umbrella when it started to rain. When is the time clause connector. Because the time clause connector appears in the middle of the sentence, we do not need to use commas to separate the two clauses. If you are interested in learning more about verb tenses and time clauses, in particular, what happens to time clauses when we use different tenses, the future tense, the present tense, and the past tense, please click on the link below. We hope you've enjoyed our video.